Well, I want to greet you wherever you may be, all over the world, I hope. Uh, and I want to discuss with you the possible organizing perspective for this coming period. Now, as you have noticed, one could not help to notice it, there were two extremely opposite developments happening in the last week. One absolutely horrible and a foreboding of the potential coming disaster in the form of the inability of Texas and some other US states to respond to a polar cold coming from the polar region, creating almost blackouts, and 36 people died in the United States. Now, that is one direction of where the world could go if we would go ahead with what is the plans of the central banks and most governments in the United States, the European Union, the British government, namely to implement the so-called Great Reset or the Green New Deal. Because if you move the entire energy production and consumption to the kinds of energies which showed their absolute vulnerability in this cold, then you would have a much, much worse collapse of industrial production to come. And I want to contrast that today with another development, which is exactly diametrical, the opposite, and that is the extreme fantastic optimism which was generated by everybody who watched the 3 nations Mars missions, starting on the 9th with the United Arab Emirates, on the 10th, the Chinese Tianwen mission, and on the 18th, the Perseverance project of NASA was reaching Mars. And that shows you what human creativity is capable of. Now, we published in the same period, and it's almost like, the events in Texas and 14 other states in the United States with the blackouts were sort of, it was like a prescience that we had our report out just for this event to happen. The report we named The Great Leap Backward. LaRouche exposes the Green New Deal. And this is I think, 60-page excellent study which shows exactly what are the plans of the financial oligarchy, of Wall Street, of the City of London, by basically making the great transformation, not only going out of nuclear, but going out of fossil fuels and transforming the entire economy to green investments only. And given the fact that the financial system of the transatlantic sector is absolutely bankrupt and could blow out any moment, what these central banks and other major financial institutions want to do, they want to create another mega bubble by investing 30 to even $50 trillion worth in green technology, in the transformation of the economy. And naturally, the speculators and the big banks are intending to make a mega profit in part speculating on things which don't exist, like CO2 emission certificates, which is really something which is complete bubble and speculating on hot air. And that would do exactly what we have seen in Texas, but on a much, much larger scale. Now, if you go into renewable energy sources only, that means the end of industrial nations. Because as my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has demonstrated in many of his writings, and that is one of the most important conceptual breakthroughs he made, that he showed the correlation between the energy flux density, which is used in the process of production, and the correlating number of people which can be maintained with such energy flux density. Now, if you go to extremely low flux densities, like it is the case with solar and with wind, well, then you reduce automatically the number of people who can be maintained to that, to the periods before the Industrial Revolution. And as some people like Schellenhuber have already said many years ago, the desired population level of the planet is, according to these people who are utter Malthusians, about 1 billion or maybe 2 billion at most. So what happened is basically that in Texas, the oil state, and in Houston, which is supposedly the energy capital of the world, you had a complete collapse. And this state and other states were only seconds away from total blackouts, which could only be prevented by sort of controlled blackouts. Nevertheless, the consequences were that 36 people have died. Now, the wind turbines got frozen up. They had icicles on their blades, so they couldn't turn. Naturally, they did not produce any energy. The solar panels were covered with snow. Naturally, this proves, the main argument against the only use of these energy sources, that you don't have energy when the wind doesn't blow, or the blades are frozen, and the sun doesn't shine. And therefore, you could actually see that the main argument that this is pure ideology, it has nothing to do with science, it has nothing to do with industrial production, it has only to do with green ideology, and that green ideology kills people. Now, the question is, how could the United States, which after all is still the most powerful economy in the world, how could they so utterly fail? What is wrong with the US system? Well, it's the same thing which is wrong with the system of the European Union, namely that it's based on neoliberal theory. That is, it goes for profit maximization of the speculators, and does not pay attention to the common good. Now, therefore, in addition to the vulnerability of these renewable resources, energy sources, you have basically no maintenance. If these things, which are really the cornerstone of what is required for the economy, like infrastructure, energy production and distribution, health systems, all of these things should not be privatized. But if they are privatized, then naturally the maintenance gets put on a back burner, and all of these systems require extremely constant maintenance and upgrade. Now, the brutal character of this system got really absolutely demonstrated by the unspeakable remarks of the mayor of Colorado, Texas, Tim Boyd, who had the nerve to say, "No one owes you and your family anything." He said that to the victims of the blackouts. "Nor is it that the local government's responsibility to support you during times like this." And now listen to this: "Only the strong will survive and the weak will perish." Now, Mr. Boyd, and maybe it has something to do with his name, that Nomen est Omen, that Boyd, the tribe of Boyd, is having such views. He basically had to resign since. But if you look at what happened, is that some people who had variable rate plans, they, normally when there is a peak in the energy consumption, the prices go up. So some people who normally would pay $125 to $150 a month, because of these variable rates, had bills which in one case went up to $10,000, and in another case $17,000. And they could not switch to permanent cost because the alternative energy companies wouldn't take them because it was an overload. So these people are now sitting there on their bills, and this is what this governor, this mayor from Colorado, Texas, said. So, so this is basically a mild foretaste what would come if the Green New Deal would be implemented in general. And that is what is on the agenda in the European Union. This is what President of the EU Commission von der Leyen is busy in implementing. And this is what the new Biden administration is committed to do. Now, for the industrial nations, this would mean that all energy intensive industries would collapse, or they would go abroad and just could not stay in Europe or the United States. They would go to some other country or collapse. And it would mean a complete collapse of living standards in Europe and the United States. There was already in 2012 or 2011 a study made by the Scientific Advisory Commission of the German Parliament, who studied what will happen if there is blackouts of the system. And as I said, in Texas, it was seconds away from a general blackout. They came to the conclusion that if highly integrated grids like that of Europe, for example, would collapse, then within hours, everything would come to a standstill. You would have basically no smartphone use because you couldn't reload it with electricity. You couldn't have fuel. You couldn't drive your car. The supermarkets would be empty or even looted. Gas stations wouldn't function. Transport, trains, everything would come to a standstill. You would have huge traffic jams before everything would stop. Hospitals would not be supplied. People would die. Medical supply would also be not there. And in general, you would have chaos. And naturally, given the extreme volatility of societies already because of the COVID pandemic, because of opposition to the measures taken, and the general polarization in the United States, which we see right now as a result of the contested election, the danger of general social chaos is also absolutely on the agenda. Now, that would be terrible for the advanced sector, but for the developing countries, it would mean mass death. I mean, the developing countries already right now are in absolute peril. The pandemic is having changes in the strains. New variants develop in Brazil, in South Africa, in Great Britain, which are much more contagious. Therefore, even with the lockdown measures, still the infection rates don't go down. And we have not even an inkling what is happening in continents like Africa or Latin America, because the testing is very little. And even before the pandemic erupted, the health system was in an abysmal condition. Now, according to the World Food Program, there is the danger of up to 300 million people dying of famine this year. And naturally, if then the industrial countries from whom the kind of measures and industrial production would have to come, which would be needed to do what we are fighting for, namely to have a modern health system in every country, these capacities would collapse and you would have mass deaths. And that is obviously what the Malthusians, like the British monarchy, which is sponsoring a lot of these ideas for decades, actually since more than a century, really intend. These are Malthusian views, which basically would mean to depopulate the world by the four horsemen of the apocalypse: hunger, death, war, pestilence, and many people would leave their life. Now, basically, what the immediate task therefore is, and I'm urging all of you to study this special report by EIR, which is an absolute must-read document to understand what is the danger with the green reset. And I would ask your participation to help to make sure that all relevant places in governments around the world, the relevant parliamentarians get access to this report, and also that it be discussed in universities, that you contact professors, you make it a subject of debate among among students, and that we really have no less intention than to defeat this great reset. And in one sense, the blackout in Texas was maybe a donation from St. Peter, who is in charge of the weather up there, so that he gave us a notice of warning of what are the consequences of these policies. Now, let me contrast that with a completely different approach, namely that if you use human creativity and the ability of the human mind to again and again discover new physical principles of the universe, and you apply those, that in an extremely short period of time, you can overcome the most underdevelopment and poorest countries in the world, and by leapfrogging to the most modern technologies, accomplish incredible breakthroughs. Now, in the history of mankind, if you take universal history as one large process, the torch of progress was not always belonging to one nation, but it shifted from one civilization and one culture to another one. And for example, if you look at the last 2000 years, after the collapse of the Roman Empire in Europe, where Europe plunged into a dark age, into the Middle Ages and the dark age then of the 14th century, which was a real setback for European civilization. At the same time, you had in India the Gupta period, which produced some of the most beautiful poetical creations, dramas, poetry, and also at the same time, or a little bit later, you had the replacement of the Umayyad period in the Arab world with the Abbasid period, which happened in 750. Now, the Caliphate, which emerged at that time, Baghdad was created in 766, and this was at that time became very quickly the most developed city on the planet. In a few years, more than 100,000 architects, construction workers, engineers, craftsmen built the city under the leadership of Caliph al-Mansur. And at that point, Baghdad was the most modern city in the world. And with Harun al-Rashid, there started a dialogue with Charlemagne, which led to the Carolingian Renaissance. And then the son of al-Rashid, his name was al-Mansur, who lived from 813 to 833. Baghdad became the scientific research center of the world. He created something which was called the House of Wisdom, and they had the good sense to send emissaries to Egypt, to Spain, to Portugal, to Greece, and every knowledge, every discovery, every book which these people, these emissaries would bring back, the Caliph was weighing in gold in order to show the appreciation to collect all this knowledge. So at that time, you had a real dialogue of cultures. You had an exchange of scientific discoveries of architecture, hydraulics, navigation. You had the emergence of the Arab number system, which really came from India, but it was basically carried by a person called Al-Khwarizmi, whose Latin name was algorithmi, whose fame you still have in the form of algorithms today. So then a little later you had Ibn Sina, his Latin name was Avicenna, who basically developed the most developed system of medicine. And the book he wrote was the standard teaching book of medicine, even in Europe until the 17th century. So this was, as I said, the high period where the Abbasid period was the most advanced period in history all over the world. Then came a period of stagnation and collapse, and the Southwest Asia whole region plunged really into a period of going backwards. Now I make a little jump. My late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, and I were invited in 2002 to the United Arab Emirates, to Abu Dhabi, to a conference, a two-day conference on the future of oil. Now, oil was developed or was discovered in the Middle East at the beginning of the 20th century and basically used by the British Navy when they switched from coal-powered ships to oil-sponsored ships. But it was not playing a major role for the region itself. In the United Arab Emirates, the first time they had an own refinery was only in 1999. So we were there about 3 years after this first refinery started its functioning. Now, the subject of the conference, which was organized by the Sayed Center, was the role of oil and gas in world politics. And Lynn was invited to give a speech on the future of oil. And he basically made a very prescient and prophetic speech what should happen with this oil. Now, he said that, obviously the region of Southwest Asia was not only important for the discovery of oil, but if you look at the map, this region is at the crossroad between Asia and Europe and Asia and the African continent. And therefore, basically, it is of strategic importance. So Lynn said at that time, and this was 2002, this was 1 year after the 9/11 attack. The Islamic world was under great attack at that time. So Lynn basically said, do not follow the example of the United States, because if the world follows the policies of the US at that time, they will plunge the whole world into a dark age like the 14th century. And he said basically that hopefully there would be wise governments who would follow the alternative. So he basically said that petroleum would play maybe for one generation or a little bit more a role as a fuel, but basically it would change its character. And then he made a very beautiful pedagogical example. He said, well, let's just imagine the map of this region as a whole and zoom in as if from an orbiting space station. We would zoom in this region and watch the long-range historical process of what has been going on in this region in the last 20,000 years. So he said, well, about 19,000 years ago, the ocean levels in this region were about 400 feet below the levels today. And if you look at this region in a lapse time panorama, where you reduce these 20,000 years to a few minutes, you can actually see how the desert is growing in the entire region from the Atlantic coast of Africa all the way through the Sahara, through the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, through Iraq, Iran, all the way to China. And there is basically this continuous growth of the desert. And this entire period of the last 20,000 years was an incredible struggle against aridization. And he said, today, because of breakthroughs in science and technology, we have the chance to not only control this process, but to reverse it. So he said, therefore, the role of the oil, which people own, is shifting, and you should not think about the oil, but you should think in terms of the resources you can access by the wealth you can create with oil, to the importance of water. Then he discusses, how to irrigate the deserts, how to green the deserts, but also how the shift should go away from just trade over the sea route to the creation of land bridges. And already in 2002, he discussed, not the first time, we were discussing this earlier, but he discussed, how this region should be soon connected through land bridges, through corridors connecting Asia, Europe, and Africa, and how basically all of this, if invested in the right way, is paying for itself, because you create something with the power of creativity, the creation of science and technology, so that you are creating not only transport lines from A to B, but by creating these corridors 100-kilometer wide, you put in transport lines, fast train systems, highways, waterways, energy production and distribution, communication, and that way you create the precondition for industrialization of the whole region. Now, he also said, and I think this is very important, he said, there is no way how the United States will ever recover if the United States is not cooperating with the region of the Middle East and Africa in this way, building these land bridges. So the next thing which happened was that basically he basically gave a presentation to the Zayed Center, which was listened to by all the top ministers and many top leaders from the rest of the region. And I also had the chance a few days later to give a presentation where basically I spoke about the dialogue of civilization and encouraged the participating people to take the Abbasid period as an inspiration and apply it for today, to just take the knowledge from everywhere in the world and apply it. Now, I'm not saying that our visit there is the only thing which caused things to happen, but I'm absolutely sure it had an absolutely important aspect. When we were there in 2002, you could already see the application of water in the desert. There is an island in front of Abu Dhabi in the ocean, which only a few years earlier was complete desert. And now it has become a beautiful blooming garden, new vegetation, old vegetation, new flowers. It has become a landing spot for all the birds which travel from Europe in the wintertime to Africa. And they have changed their flight route because now they have all these beautiful berries and other foods. So they have also profited from this development. Okay, this was the beginning in 2002. Now, in 1988, Lynn made a beautiful movie, and I would like you to show a section of that movie. This was a movie called Woman in Mars, and it was Lynn's vision as a presidential candidate in the Democratic Party, what he would do if he would be president and how he would transform the US economy in collaboration with other countries to make sure that around the year 2027, you would have people living on Mars. And that was obviously what we had discussed earlier many times with the absolute visionary Kraft Erike, a German-American rocket scientist who has written books which are still absolutely inspirational about a colony on the moon, on the Mars. So let's now listen to Lynn's visionary words from 1988.
There are two reasons we must choose a Mars project as the way to achieve the rates of economic growth needed. First, there are powerful reasons we must have a colony on Mars. To achieve certain very specific kinds of scientific breakthroughs we shall need on Earth, we must do the kind of astrophysical research we cannot do without a Mars project. The practical purpose is to build up a system of giant radio telescopes as far away from the sun as possible. To sustain the scientists and engineers working on these space laboratories, we need a nearby logistical base. To support those scientists and engineers requires a population about the size of a medium-sized city on Earth. Since Mars is the nearest location which meets the requirements, we must colonize Mars. The second reason is that the Mars project uses every frontier technology we might expect to develop during the coming 50 years of scientific research. That means that the space program will be supplying our civilian industries with the most advanced technologies possible at the most rapid rate, putting the United States permanently in first place in technology. These technologies include plasma processes, which are not only energy sources for all mankind during the coming 50 years and more, but also the new basic industrial technologies. Once we can bring sufficient cheap energy to bear, not only to boil tungsten, but to heat it into a plasma state, all limits to natural resources, as we now define such limits, cease to exist. A second related technology is that represented in a primitive way by today's laser machine tools. This means controlling the entire electromagnetic spectrum as the basic tool of production for uncounted centuries still to come. A third technology is modern optical biophysics, perhaps the only technology which will enable us to provide cures for such diseases as cancer and AIDS. Apart from human health needs, this is the great revolution in biology for the remainder of this century and the next. Every other breakthrough in technology we can foresee, until the time we master what we call the anti-matter reaction as an energy source, will fall among these three categories of scientific research and development. By putting all these technologies into a single mission-oriented research and development project, we are able to ensure that the United States will be first in technology for 50 years to come. With this Mars program, we can assure every one of you that your children and grandchildren have the opportunity for a bright future. That, in my opinion, is the true mission of government.
Lyndon LaRouche sums up his report by describing the way in which the Mars mission project will spill new technologies and entirely new industries into an expanding job market.
As president, I shall call together the representatives of industries, including the automotive and aerospace sector. I shall say to them, ladies and gentlemen, I need your cooperation to give the United States the world's most advanced tool industry. I shall wrestle with the Congress to provide such legislation as we need for you to do your job properly. We are going to get the last disgusting vestige of decay, pollution, and poverty out of this nation's life. And you are going to play a key part in bringing this about. It will work like this. First, as I told you in my broadcast several weeks ago, we are going to pour about $2 trillion a year of low-cost credit into infrastructure and industrial expansion. Second, we're going to have an emergency tax reform which stimulates investment with investment tax credit incentives. Third, the research and development of the project will be tightly interfaced with the growth of our modernized tool sector. This means that the tool sector will have the new technologies available as rapidly as they're developed. It means that industry can obtain uses of these technologies as rapidly as they are developed. With ample low-cost credit for investments in new technologies, plus investment tax credit incentives, our national economy will achieve the highest rate of technological growth in history. This will require sweeping improvements in public school education. It requires more classics and science in the schools. It will require National Science Foundation scholarships and merit pay increases for teachers, and will require National Science Foundation assistance to local schools in providing the exhibits and other teaching materials needed to introduce students to the new space-age technologies. This requires a shift away from present trends in business education to produce more managers qualified in production technologies. It means a much better way to live than the drab misery, illiteracy, and decay into which our nation has been drifting the past 20 years. Then, 39 years from now, we shall hear the broadcast from Mars announcing that the first permanent colony there is operational. Among those colonists will be some of the children and grandchildren of you watching this broadcast tonight. Many of you will be watching that first television broadcast from that new colony. Already, the woman who will speak to you then from Mars has just recently been born somewhere in the United States. We shall give our nation once again that great future which our children and grandchildren deserve.
I have the announcement you've been waiting for. As of 5 minutes ago, our environmental systems have been fully stabilized. Man's first permanent colony on Mars is now fully operational.
Well, obviously, it did not happen exactly like that. Lynn did not become president for the reasons of the oligarchy hating this vision. But I can say that this woman has been born, or a woman like that, but not in the United States, but in the United Arab Emirates. I don't know if exactly she was born in 1988, but you have now a young woman, I think she's now 33 years old, who is Minister of Space in the Emirates, and she's also the head of the Emirate Space Agency. Now, she and a group of other young scientists started only in 2015 to go for a Mars mission project. And I want you now to play the TED speech of Sarah Al-Amiri. Well, I think that that is clearly, getting you completely excited, because, this is the way to overcome backwardness, overcome chauvinism, overcome conflict among nations. And I'm very, very inspired by this very remarkable woman. And, she and about 200 of her collaborators were successful in getting the Mars orbiter Hope into orbit of Mars just a few days ago. So let's look at the next video. Well, if the United Arab Emirates can do it, every single nation on the planet can do it in an equally short time. And this is the promise to overcome underdevelopment forever. So I think the choices are very clear: the Great Reset, going into the dark age, and space cooperation leading to a new era of civilization. So let's discuss this now.